Good afternoon. This video opens a new series dedicated to such a great mystery that even the very existence of this mystery has been masked for centuries. Its entire history has been shrouded in an aura of mysticism and mystery from the very beginning, but only for those who look at it. Very few people actually look at it, and together we will try to lift this veil just a little bit. But don't think that by the end of this video, everything will become clear to you. No, but we have to start somewhere. So let's begin. It would seem that the history of the last 300 years has been thoroughly studied, inside and out, by everyone who cares to. Official history clings to these years as an unshakable stronghold. All the key figures, their motives and incentives have been thoroughly studied. Biographies, battle plans, and troop movements have been fully examined. It would seem there's nothing left to uncover. However, these very centuries are also one of the favorite targets for alternative theorists. And not without reason. Despite everything, the number of inconsistencies skyrockets in direct proportion to the increased amount of information. Let's take, for example, Pyotr I. Some people claim that he was replaced. Others argue that he didn't build Petersburg. There are plenty of mysteries. Just as there are plenty of people who notice inconsistencies and ask questions. So let our first character be Pyotr I, but from a rather unusual angle. Let's take a segment equal to the length of his life. And let's quickly go through the main milestones, only occasionally stopping for a break and a closer look at the facts. Why? Because sometimes you can only see the big picture from a distance. And the bigger the object, the farther you need to step back to see the whole picture. Our hero was born on May 30th, 1672. Yes, we know that there was a different calendar and different dates back then, but that's not important to us right now. It will only confuse us and lead us into unnecessary details. So once again, our hero was born on May 30, 1672. From the start, things went poorly, with a string of deaths that followed. 4 years later, his father dies, and his son from his first marriage, Pyotr, is chosen for the throne. 6 years after that, Pyotr himself dies, and just a few weeks after his death, a Streltsy uprising breaks out in Moscow. They apparently suspected something was amiss. But 10 days later, the 10-year-old Pyotr and his brother Ivan V were proclaimed czars. And 3 days after that, their older sister, Princess Sofia, became the regent ruler. A month later, Ivan and Pyotr were crowned, and for the next 7 years, Sofia ruled unchallenged. But in the fall of 1689, she was deposed and sent to the Novodevichy convent. Apparently, she resisted and didn't want to give up power to the Tsars. I emphasize to the Tsars Peter and Ivan. The dual rule, the younger Peter was favored by the boyars, while the elder Ivan was favored by the Streltsy and the people. This may seem like a small detail, but it's a very important nuance that we'll remember more than once. 6 years of dual rule passed, and then on February 6th, 1695, 23-year-old Peter made his move.
His first
Azov campaign. Let's pause here for a moment and clarify. What exactly was the situation in the world at that time? On the same day, February 6th, the mathematician Nikolai Bernoulli was born, and in the same year, the astronomer Christian Huygens, the inventor of the wave theory of light, passed away. France is at war with Spain. Denmark and Holland are at war with Sweden, which in turn is an ally of France. The Holy Roman Empire is mired in the War of the Augsburg League, and the Polish-Turkish War is in full swing. It was in this year that the Battle of Lviv took place between the Crimean Tatars and the Poles. In Sweden, 2 years before that, Queen Ulrika Eleonora died, and Karl learned to remain the ruler. Also that year, there was a severe crop failure in Sweden. However, the strangest things were happening on the other side of the world in the Ottoman Empire. Historians casually mention that in that year, Sultan Ahmed died and Sultan Mustafa took the throne. You might wonder what's strange about that. Well, everyone dies. Yes, and in Wikipedia, this event is usually listed at the very end. However, here we encounter some kind of number magic. Judge for yourself. February 6 is Mustafa's birthday, and on February 6, 1695, Ahmed dies. So Mustafa II becomes Sultan on his own birthday. And it is on this very day, February 6, 1695, that Pyotr decides to go to war against the Ottoman Empire and take Azov. The day chosen to start the operation is perfect. It's as if Pyotr knew something, but there was no internet or telephone back then. I don't think it's just a coincidence, but the question is, how? Carrier pigeon? The news of Ahmed's death reached Pyotr on the same day, and on that very day he decided to go to war in the winter. Or is it really just an incredible coincidence? And from this point of view, the motives of the young Pyotr to take advantage of the war between the Ottoman Empire and Poland, the turmoil after the death of the Sultan, and to go to war for Azov seemed to become clearer. And so, 4 months later, in June of 1695, the Russian troops laid siege to Azov. That means the army marched almost 1,200 kilometers, covering about 10 to 12 kilometers a day. They weren't really in a hurry, but their army was quite large. 3 groups with a total of almost 30,000 men. Actually, there are a lot of inconsistencies and contradictions in this campaign, but we won't dwell on them. We're looking at the bigger picture, so let's move on. We already know that it took 4 months for the army to move from Azov to Moscow, so it's logical to assume that the return journey was no shorter. And that means if the siege was lifted on October 2, then by January 1696, the troops should have arrived in Moscow. And again, by a strange coincidence or cruel fate, it was exactly in January 1696, on the 29th, apparently right after the troops returned, that Tsar Ivan died. On May 16, 1696, the troops besieged Azov again, but this time there were twice as many, 70,000. Hence the strange thought. First of all, the troops set out on the second campaign almost without any rest. That is, they arrived in Moscow, joined up with reinforcements, and immediately set out back. Well, that's how it works out chronologically. Secondly, where did an extra 40,000 soldiers suddenly come from? It's logical to assume that since there were 2 rulers during Peter's first campaign, the army was also divided into 2 halves. Half was with Peter, the other, larger half was with Ivan, and perhaps Ivan didn't want to share it, but conveniently, he passed away. Sorry, but I can't explain the sudden appearance of an army twice as large, practically out of nowhere, all at once, even without recruitment in any other way. So, on May 16, 1696, Russian troops once again laid siege to Azov. And despite the garrison being supported by 60,000 Tatars, meaning the forces were at least equal, on July 19, Azov surrendered. Almost immediately on July 27, the city of Taganrog was founded, and Pyotr returned to Moscow. And a few months later, it was already March 10, 1697. He set off on his grand embassy to Europe. Why? Really, why? Europe is busy with its own problems at this moment. Sweden had no intention of going to war with us. What kind of allies was he planning to look for there, and for what purpose? However, once again, by a strange coincidence, 25 days after Pyotr left, the King of Sweden, Karl, died of stomach cancer in Stockholm. It should be noted that he began complaining of severe pain as early as February, In March, Pyotr urgently rushed to the Grand Embassy, and by April 5th, Karl had already passed away. By the way, this was the same Karl whose mournful speech, written in Russian but with Latin letters, is often shown to us by alternative researchers. Well, that's that. Let's continue. As we can see, death is literally following in Pyotr's footsteps, and for now, Pyotr is not here. Right in April, on these very same dates, the 3rd to the 5th of April, a Streltsy uprising breaks out in Moscow, which was suppressed on June 18th during the battle at the New Jerusalem Monastery near Istra. On August 25th of the same year, Pyotr urgently returns to Moscow. And judging by the timing, again, he didn't really have much time to travel, so he probably didn't achieve his goal, returning halfway through, precisely because of the rebellion. Executions and investigations of the Streltsy continued throughout the fall. And a year later, in November 1699, a treaty was signed with Saxony and Denmark against Sweden. What happened during that whole year? What caused the rift between Russia and Sweden? Did the new King Karl want to go to war with Russia? Or on the contrary, did Pyotr want to attack it? It's not clear yet, but we will definitely figure it out. So, things are heading towards war. On December 20th, 1699, a new calendar system was introduced. As they say, nothing foretold it, and here we go again. That is, there are a lot of speculations about why this was done, but against the backdrop of everything that was happening. Wasn't this a condition set by the Saxons for an alliance against Sweden? On July 3rd, 1700, a peace treaty was signed with Turkey, under which several small fortresses were returned to it with the obligation that they would be subsequently destroyed. The parties agreed not to build defensive structures on the borders and pledged to maintain peace for 30 years. This freed Peter's hands and he entered the Great Northern War with Sweden. The question is, why? Of course, Wikipedia and school tell us that it was necessary to gain access to the sea, but for what purpose? We already had Arkhangelsk in the north and Taganrog with Azov in the south. The most reasonable people will say that this way a single water route was formed from the Black Sea to the Baltic Sea along the rivers of Russia, with a transfer somewhere in Moscow or Tver. Perhaps, and it does sound quite reasonable, like a kind of new Silk Road. But let's not jump to conclusions. Let's see what happened next. In November 1700, Pyotr went to war against Sweden and laid siege to the fortress of Narva. And now let's pause here for a bit longer. Why Narva specifically? Look at its geographical location. A small fortress, a star-shaped one, located on the bank of a tiny little river, 12 kilometers from the seashore. On the eve of this war, again, 2 out of 3 of Peter's generals who took Azov die. That's Lefort and Gordon. And in total, more than 60,000 soldiers were brought up to this unfortunate fortress. Why did they even need to take it? Who needed it? Deep in the mainland, what was it guarding? The Narva Reservoir didn't exist at that time. And if Peter needed access to the sea, it would have been quite possible to simply surround it and take it from the sea without an assault. But no. One of the bloodiest battles broke out, during which we lost. And Pyotr, who had never left the battlefield before, for some reason ran away. However, if you look at one of the diagrams of the troop positions before the battle, you'll be surprised to see something near the fortress that looks like a shoreline. This could happen if the water level was about 12 meters higher than it is now. Moreover, with the water at that level, there really would have been a swamp where St. Petersburg is now. Plus the strange choice of timing, November, attacking a northern city during the cold season. I'm not a strategist, of course, but in my opinion, it's not a great idea. So, on November 19th, 1700, Russian troops lost the battle for the completely unnecessary Narva. And just 2 months later, on January 14th, 1701, Pyotr issues a decree to establish the navigation school. So, apparently there were no other concerns. Let's move on. From 1701 to 1702, clashes with Swedish troops continue unexpectedly in a different direction from Narva, in the area between the Gulf of Riga and Lake Peipus. There, the Russian army won its first 2 major victories in the battles of Arasvir and Hummelshof. What is strange about these battles? The strange thing is that it seems like the Swedes are trying to break through somewhere to the south, and Pyotr is trying to stop them. In the fall of 1700, Pyotr launched a counterattack in a place unexpected by the Swedes, taking control of the Orshak fortress on Lake Ladoga. And after a long 7 months, already in May, he took control of the Nyenchans fortress. This is already within the boundaries of the modern city of Petersburg. By the way, why did it take Pyotr 7 months to do this? And where was the Swedish army all this time? 9 days later, Pyotr, in quotes, found St. Petersburg. A lot has already been said about this moment, but our task is to quickly go over the main points, so we won't dwell on this for long either. Not yet. A year later, in 1704, the capture of Derpt and Narva. Wait, well, Narva is clear, but Derpt, it's not far from Gummelsgård and Arasvir, where we just recently won a victory. And then suddenly a series of uprisings. First, the Astrakhan uprising from 1705 to 1706, and then right after that, the Don uprising led by Bulavin from 1707 to 1708. So, 3 or 4 years of uprisings and revolts during which Bulavin, by the way, for some reason tried to take Azov. Why? Well, it doesn't matter for now. And what were the Swedes doing all this time? Nothing. Strange politeness. Real gentlemen. However, as soon as the uprisings were suppressed, Karl finally ordered his general, Lewenhaupt, to gather an army with the aim of invading Russia again. Lewenhaupt gathered about 16,000 men, after which he got his butt kicked at the Battle of Lesnaya by Peter, who rushed in hastily. And where is this Lesnaya? Well, that's in the Mogilev region of Belarus, not far from Smolensk. How did the Swedes end up there? It's thousands of kilometers south of Narva. That raises some suspicions. First of all, that the Swedes aren't such gentlemen after all. And during all 4 years of uprisings in Russia, they quietly kept on their journey. And secondly, the path to where? To the south. That means they didn't really need Russia that much. The campaign's purpose was apparently different. In any case, that's the impression you get. And on their way, they had a choice. Either to fight with Poland or with Russia. But why? Where were they going? That's the question. 6 months later, on June 27, 1709, Pyotr defeated the Swedes again, this time at Poltava. Again, excuse me, that's another 1,000 kilometers south of the previous battle. How is that possible? We keep winning, but the Swedish forces keep moving south. I think we can already draw some conclusions. Let's look at the battle map in chronological order. It forms a clear line that reaches the coast of the Sea of Azov, just over 100 kilometers from Taganrog and Azov. 3 days later, the Russian army captured the remaining Swedes. Another 200 kilometers south near Perevoloknaya, the Swedes stubbornly kept fleeing south, as if they had forgotten where their homeland was. Nevertheless, Karl managed to reach the Turkish border. Thus, Karl found himself within the borders of the Ottoman Empire. On one side was Russia, on another side Poland, and on the third side the Saxons and the Roman Empire. Of course, he could try to break through to his homeland via Poland or to France through the Saxons, but without a significant army. That would be tantamount to suicide. That means Karl was trapped in Bender on Turkish territory. Peter wasted no time taking advantage of this opportunity and spent the next 1.5 to 2 years capturing the unprotected cities of Riga, Revel, Vyborg, Kiksholm, and others. However, 2 years later, Peter decided to finally finish off Karl and went searching for him in Bessarabia. He reached the Prut River near Iasi with his army, where he found Karl, and also a 5 times larger Ottoman force, which quickly surrounded Peter. It seemed like that was it. There was no chance of survival. Peter understood this as well, so he sent a negotiator to the Turkish vizier with a huge sum of money, 150,000 rubles, to make a deal. And strangely enough, it worked. The Turks signed the Treaty of Prut, even though Peter had no chance of escaping. What is this unprecedented act of generosity? Why did the Sultan let the Tsar go, even though he had the chance to seize all of Russia and even Sweden? What was the balancing condition from Peter's side, for which the Turkish Sultan basically spared his life? But what was it for? First, to let go of Poland. Second, not to touch the Cossacks. Third, the promise to let Charles return home to Sweden. And fourth, to destroy Taganrog. Moreover, after signing the treaty, the Turks even provided the Russian army with their cavalry to protect them from Tatar raids. You all understood everything, but personally I did not. After this event, Pyotr did not fight anymore for the next 12 years. Pyotr seemed to have calmed down and redirected all his energy to raising the country. He issued decrees, built cities, carried out reforms, and wove intrigues. But the active wars were over, and in 1721 the Treaty of Neustadt was even signed with Sweden. However, the poet's soul could not endure it. 12 years later, in 1722, Pyotr decided to go to war again. This time he decided to annex the western and southern coasts of the Caspian Sea to Russia. He succeeded in doing that. In 1723, the Caspian campaigns ended in victory, and a little over a year later, in January 1725, Pyotr suddenly died. So, what new things did we learn from today's video? We learned about 3 opposing powers at the beginning of the 18th century: Russia, Sweden, and Turkey. We learned about their complicated relationships and a kind of manic desire all 3 had to take control of Azov, Taganrog, and the future St. Petersburg. At the very beginning of these events, the area with St. Petersburg was controlled by the Swedes and Azov by the Turks. But neither of them made any profit from this, because Russia was located between these cities, or maybe for some other reason. At the end of the story, Russia came to possess Petersburg and nominally Taganrog, although both were in a ruined state. But that's just the very beginning of the story. It gets more interesting from here. Friends, none of us are immune to mistakes. And if you notice a flaw in my logic, don't hesitate. Clearly, competently, and without hesitation, leave your angry comment under the video.